Gentlemen and ladies, this is John Fisher of All About the Jersey, and welcome to my presentation on Killing Time, where I analyze zone exits on penalty kills, primarily featuring the New Jersey Devils. This is the exact slide deck I'm going to be presenting in Rochester on Saturday, September 10th, at the Rochester Institute of Technology Hockey Analytics Conference. In that presentation, I'm flying through this presentation, so this is going to be a more casual, relaxed, take your time, download and digest the information sort of presentation. I've also uploaded my first uncut, raw, uncensored, completely redundant first draft where I talked really long at length. So this is a nice middle option if you thought I went too fast at the conference and you don't want to hear 80 minutes going through what was essentially the something that got cut down to something that's a lot better as a presentation, both from a timing and a tightness standpoint, for lack of a better term. So let's get to it. First and foremost, I want to thank people first, and I pretty much will jump through this live, but I want to specifically thank each of the individual points here. First and foremost, I have to thank Ryan Stimson and the RITHAC organizers, because without Ryan's help, this project doesn't get off the ground. He helped me a lot 2 summers ago, and he's encouraged me to present this sort of thing and to get this information out there and to really dive into it. So I thank him for that, and I obviously have to thank the organizers for having me at the event at all. I also have to thank Timo Seppa at Hockey Prospectus, because on a very long car ride coming back from DC's Hockey Analytics Conference in Georgetown from 2 years ago, I had the idea in my head, and I told him about it with respect to, how much time does an icing really kill on a penalty kill? And he said, it must be 12 to 13 seconds. And I said, yeah, but does that vary for team or player? And he says, I don't know. And maybe it's worth looking at. Or he said something to that effect. At the very least, he didn't think it was a dumb idea. So I went ahead and did it with the help of his confidence, or at least his lack of dismissal. In addition to that, I have to thank NHL.tv and NHL.com for as much criticism as they get in the larger scene. I really couldn't have done this in this at all without the NHL being able for people to post up videos from last season of full game tape and allow people to go through them as they wish. And NHL.com, say what you want about the data, they are the sources of the data that a lot of these sites uses, and therefore, they're not going to go away. So I have to thank them for having the information and, more importantly, having the game video available. I also have to thank sites like Corsica, Hockey Reference, and War on Ice, where I use them at points within this presentation, and you'll see them called out as necessary. I have to give a special shout out to Natural Stat Trick, because they have game-by-game data with respect to Corsi against, shots against, and Fenwick against, and you'll see how this ties in a little bit later, about midway through this presentation. I also have to thank my family and my girlfriend for putting up with me during this entire tracking process with respect to hearing about it, what's involved, listening to this presentation, telling them to please listen to the presentation. So I thank them for their cooperation, their general moral and practical support, and of course, their patience. I also have to thank Brian Franken and the other writers at All About the Jersey. The other writers at All About the Jersey are all volunteers, and I'm very grateful and appreciate the fact that they do write stuff even through the dead of summer on days that I asked them to write stuff. So therefore, I'm glad that they've done that. But I have to specifically thank Brian, because, like Ryan, he was very instrumental at the beginning of all this 2 summers ago in terms of, how do I do this tracking? What's a good way to do this? Does this make sense? So Brian and Ryan both helped me out a lot with that. And of course, most of all, I have to thank the readers of All About the Jersey, because quite frankly, I'm a blogger. I'm not a, analyst. This is not a day job. This is definitely not much of a job if I told you how much it makes. But the fact of the matter is, I am nothing without the readers. And I get annoyed and angry and bothered and concerned when I see my colleagues and my fellow bloggers, not at All About the Jersey, of course, I'm talking about the larger hockey writing scene that you see on Twitter and so forth, when they go to their little Slack chat rooms and their tweets and their Facebooks, and they're pointing and making fun of other people because they had a wrong opinion or they said something they didn't like, not realizing that, they wouldn't like if somebody did that to them. So, to that end, I don't want to do that, and it's because of that I'd like to think I respect my readers. And to that extent, I have to appreciate their continued readership, because without them, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing the site, and I'm not doing this presentation. So, if you're a blogger, treat your readers well, because without them, you're nothing. Because without my readers, I'm nothing. So let's get into it. Do penalty kills matter? In the last 2 seasons, if you go to NHL.com, your average number of penalty kills per game by team ranges from 2.4 to 3.5. So on average, a team is going to have to deal with 2, 3, and maybe 4 penalty kills a night. So penalty kills happen frequently enough to be a regular occurrence, even if it doesn't take up a majority of the ice time in a game. Scoring is at a premium. You probably have witnessed a lot of articles every season. I'm sure it's going to happen around November and December of this year about how scoring is down. And according to Hockey Reference, we're down to 2.71 goals per game. Meaning, if you are a team trying to be competitive in the NHL, giving up goals really does hurt, because you may not necessarily have the offensive weaponry or be able to beat the other team's goaltender to make up that difference. So between the first 2 points, giving up power play goals is a negative. And on top of that, coaches, players, and tactics get assigned for special teams, including the penalty kill. So there are assistant coaches that focus on this in addition to their other duties. There are players that get even signed in some cases to be a part of the penalty kill. And the tactics are very different than 5-on-5 play. So my conclusion from all this is, penalty kills have to matter, at least to some degree. We can't just say, do great in 5-on-5 hockey and you're set. I mean, you'll get a lot of things right, and you probably will be pretty good on special teams if you have the right players for 5-on-5 play, but you can't just say PKs can be shunted to the side and ignored. They do matter. So let's look into the common measurements that we use for penalty kills. Success rate is the biggest one. Goals allowed per shorthanded situation, because it focuses on the big picture, important question: did you give up a goal? If you gave up a goal, that's bad. You failed. If you didn't give up a goal, then in the bigger picture, you succeeded. Does that tell you anything about how well the penalty killers performed? Absolutely not. You don't know whether or not the goalie got shelled and bailed everybody out, or you don't know if the penalty killers, had a great time and the opposition power play were made to look like a bunch of scrubs. You have no idea from that. So to get down to some granularity, some more detail, you have shorthanded Corsi against per 60 or shots against per 60. Now, that's an attempted shot rate or an actual shot rate in shorthanded situations. And commonly, sites like Corsica and so forth focus on 4-on-5 because, again, that's the more common shorthanded situation. And it identifies how much has been allowed. Now, granted, in a per 60-minute rate, it allows you to even up the fact that not every team takes penalties on the same level. Some teams are, for lack of a better term, less disciplined than others, or more undisciplined, whatever the case may be. Like I said, this is a casual presentation. In any case, you can drill this information down to the player as well as the team level, and while it doesn't really do a lot of good from, just comparing one game to another, if you have a whole bunch of games, like, say, half a season or a full season, you can start identifying, who's making sure the other team isn't just lighting them up relative to other teams. On its own, your best team is probably going to be giving up a lot of shooting attempts and a lot of shots because, hey, you're shorthanded. But if you're doing it better than the other 29 teams of the league, hey, that's a positive. But so if those measurements exist, why do we want to focus on time? Because quite frankly, neither of these two measurements tell you what actually happens on the penalty kill. It doesn't tell you how much time is eliminated with his zone exit, which really gets to the heart of the actual killing part of a penalty. Shorthanded teams are allowed to ice pucks. They're instructed to put pucks away and try to waste time whenever they can. So you really need to look at time to really find out, what's going on. So my goal is to analyze zone exits to really find that out and answer the questions of what gets done on a penalty kill. And my approach is to track the New Jersey Devils penalty kill to find those answers. And my hope, if nothing else, is that this data could and perhaps should be used in conjunction with the current PK measurements. I'm not trying to argue that this is a better way to look at a penalty kill. I'm arguing this is another way to look at the penalty kill, and it should be, keeping in mind the big picture of how many goals do you allow, and the slightly less big picture of how much are you allowing from a shots and an attempts perspective. By identifying time in terms of who's making exits and how much time you're killing, you can get a better sense of whether or not your penalty killers from the skater's point of view are really doing a good job or not. So why do we want to look at the Devils penalty kill? Quite frankly, I'm a Devils fan, and this is a New Jersey Devils site. But I have some more reasons than that. First and foremost, the Devils have been one of the least offensive teams since 2012. Their goals per game range at NHL.com is near the bottom, somewhere between 2.1 and 2.2 goals per game. Their Corsi 4 per 60 range has been horrible, according to Corsica, ranging from the low 50s to low 45, which is this horrid. The fact of the matter is that this is not a team that's going to score a lot of goals, and they don't take a lot of shooting attempts. They just don't generate a lot of offense on most nights. And as such, if they want to stay competitive, they really can't afford to give up power play goals. They just can't. If they want to be able to stay close and try to win some games on the back of Corey Schneider, then therefore their penalty kill has to be successful if they want to be able to do that. Otherwise, it's just a lot of L's and a lot of drop points and a lot of sad faces at the Prudential Center. Now, the other reason is that this team has just been plain interesting on the penalty kill for the last 2 seasons. 2 seasons ago, I defined them as 3 separate eras, where you had the Bryce Salvador era of 15 games where the Devils' penalty kill was absolutely horrid, and Bryce Salvador inexplicably got to play on the first pairing of all those penalty kills, or at least most of those most of the first minutes on the penalty kill in those 15 games. Then Salvador's season was effectively ended. Adam Larson stepped in, and before he got mumps, 10 games into it, he showed that they could be better, and the team success rate just shot up like a rocket. Now, it wasn't just because Adam Larson replaced Salvador. The goaltending got a lot better, and luck was on the Devils' side, but at the same time, these were the big events. And then after those 21 games, DeBoer got fired, and 3 people replaced him: Adam Oates, Scott Stevens, and Lou Lamoriello. And the team success rate leveled off to what I call average, or at least close to average. So they had a lot of turmoil and change and turnover within that 2014-15 season. Last season, there was a lot of change ahead of that season. 2 new defensemen, a fully healthy Adam Larson, and a completely new organization from top to bottom because Lou Lamoriello left. It's become Ray Sherrow's team very quickly with respect to new coaches, new assistant coaches, new trainers, a new scouting director, and so many other new faces in the organization. So there was a lot of turnover heading into the new season. And this is important because not only do you have a lot of changes within the teams, one of the few things that didn't change is how they defended on penalty kills. They played primarily in the triangle +1 or the wedge +1 formation, where the +1 is typically a forward and applying pressure to the perimeter of the power play. And the other 3 players, usually 2 defensemen and the other forward, they're forming a sort of triangle or a wedge, which is essentially a triangle, around the middle of the ice or some other prime part of the real estate that's open in their own end of the rink. So therefore, despite all of the changes heading into 15-16 and all the changes within 14-15, the conclusion was, the penalty kill formation is perfectly fine. So I find that to be remarkably interesting and a pretty good reason why this is a penalty kill that's worth looking at, as opposed to a team that's had more success 2 seasons ago and maybe even more success last season than the New Jersey Devils. So let's look at the methodology and what I defined that will help inform you during this presentation. So what I did was I tracked every single shorthanded situation by the Devils in the last 2 seasons. I already did 2014-15 and posted up all those results at All About the Jersey. They're included here for the point of comparison to what I tracked from this past season. And I recorded every single attempted zone exit. So that includes the type of zone exit, the number of the Devil who did it, the time the Devils left the end of the rink. So that puck, once it crosses that blue line, the clock starts on how much time is being killed by that zone exit. Because it's called a zone exit. Yes, you can argue that there could be time wasted within the Devils' end of the rink that effectively kills the clock in terms of skating to make the exit, waiting to make a movement, and so forth. I'll be honest with you and jump ahead a little bit and say, from my observations, the Devils often did not delay or waste time in their own end. If they had the opportunity to make an exit, they just went ahead and did it. But that being said, the other team is still, they could still potentially attack, and the whole point of the penalty kill is to get them to stop attacking until you get back to even strength. So, therefore, I start it when the exit begins. And I stop that clock when the puck enters to the Devils' end of the rink with the intent to attack. So I record the entry type, which defenseman was targeted, and that time when the Devils are able to, when the Devils are forced to deal with illegal zone entry by the opposition. And it has to be with the intent to attack. So it can't just be a simple dump and change by the power play. There has to be a chase involved, or there has to be an attempt to really move the puck in and do something with it. A pass back by the Devils, or by a weird loose puck that just went back to the Devils' end of the rink with no intent to attack. I don't count that as part of the time. I don't count that as an entry. I count that as additional time killed until the other team really tries to do otherwise. So there were 8 exit types I defined. Since I'm focusing on zone exits, I'm going to go over these. Icings are any intentional exit that went beyond the neutral zone. And I will admit ahead of time that if you're looking for a potential improvement, it's a better, more detailed version of icings, because anything that goes beyond the neutral zone, I just called it an icing, because by and large, the vast majority of those movements went all the way or were going to go hit the end boards before a goalie or another opposing player stopped it. So instead, you could differentiate between those that just get beyond the neutral zone and those that go beyond the dots, for example. I will admit ahead of time that that's a potential improvement that could be made to this methodology. However, the other exit types are more discrete. Clearances, any exit that just gets to the neutral zone before there's possession or something else that happens. A force out, which is an unintentional play by a Devil that led to an exit. So if they block a shot, they stick their stick out to block a pass and the puck ricochets out of the zone, that's a force out. An unforced out is an exit made by a non-Devil. So the opposition takes a slap shot, that shot misses the net by a mile, rims around the boards, goes out the other end of the Devils' end of the rink, and the other team now has to get back on side. That's an unforced out because the Devils didn't do anything directly to influence that zone exit. This also includes ends of periods, stoppages in play. Anytime there's an abbreviated penalty kill and the play starts outside of the Devils' zone, those are basically situational things that the Devils don't have control over that are technically exits, or at least start the clock of how much time is being killed outside of the Devils' zone. So that's how that's defined. Carryouts. An exit where possession was maintained across the blue line, very straightforward. A pass out. An exit where a pass was completed, not attempted, but completed across the blue line. So it has to go from Devil to Devil. And then we have the last two here. Goals allowed, which is the worst type of exit. Typically, they're going to end your penalty kill, and end the other team's power play. One is good for one, and one is bad for the other. I shouldn't have to tell you which is which. I will say, however, in situations where there's a major or there's multiple men in the box, then a goal against is an exit. I will say that the last one here isn't an exit type at all, but actually the lack of an exit. It's an intentional exit attempt prevented by somebody keeping the puck in play, or a denial, as I call them. So there's no time taken off the clock. I record who got denied because they tried to make a clearance or tried to make an icing, and it failed. And this does include hitting a Devil, includes hitting a ref. It doesn't include situations where the Devil will take the puck and then make an exit themselves. I call that like continuation. So I'm not going to punish Andy Green because Adam Henrique stopped his attempt so Adam Henrique could skate it out or ice it himself or something like that. I didn't think that was fair to Mr. Green to do so, or any other Devil in that situation. However, if it hit Adam Henrique in the back and there's a battle for the puck, that's a denial. So that's what I define, and these are the findings based on the methodology and the definitions I just explained. So this is team findings, and from here on out, it's going to be very Devil specific. However, I would like to emphasize that if you're not a Devils fan for some inexplicable reason, you can apply the same principles if you were to track this for your own team or some other team that you're tracking. So let's look at this. Let's look at the PKs in summary. So between 2 seasons ago and last season. 2 seasons ago, you can see the power play goals, the success rate, and the Corsi against per 60 rate in 4-on-5 situations. The Devils were around, they were below league median. They weren't bad, but they weren't all that good. And they killed just over 884 minutes of their total time that they had to spend killing a penalty, which is roughly 39.5%. This past season, the Devils made big improvements. Not only did they give up fewer goals, they had a better success rate, they had a better Corsi per 60 rate, but they also killed more time. They killed an additional 15 minutes. So even though they've played 7 fewer minutes, they've effectively meant they didn't have to defend or be stuck in their own end for 15 more minutes than they were 2 seasons ago. So this meant a larger percentage of their penalty killing time was killed, or just over 43.5%. That's a big improvement. Now, you'll notice at the bottom here, you still have some situations where, yeah, the Devils, by and large, in most of their games, they weren't killing more than half of a penalty, or half of the penalty they had to kill. But the Devils were better at that last season than they were 2 seasons ago. They were slightly better at beating their percent total time killed. So how many games 2 seasons ago did they beat 39.5% in a game in terms of the percentage of time they killed? That happened half the time. Last season they were actually just over half of their games. So that's a big improvement. And the 0 exit PK, that's what I call the worst case scenario. That's a situation where the Devils had a penalty killing situation where they made no exit whatsoever. It may not surprise you to hear that most of those situations ended with a goal against, and it didn't take very long for it to happen. I think you can count on one hand the number of times there wasn't a goal against in those situations. However, so those are the worst case scenarios, and the Devils were slightly better at that last season than 2 seasons ago. Now, if we look at total zone exits, the amazing thing here is the Devils made just as many zone exits as last season as they did 2 seasons ago. The main you see a difference in distribution. The Devils allowed fewer goals and got denied fewer times, so their success rate was a little bit better. It doesn't look like that 0.9% of an improvement is much, but when you consider we're dealing with over 1,000 events here, about 1% isn't exactly nothing either. So, the Devils were more successful, and it contributed a little bit, at least a little bit, to the total amount of time killed, which is very good. Now, if we look at this bar chart, if we exclude denials, just for the sake of argument here, icings, by and large, dwarf everybody else. They are the bread and butter of the New Jersey Devils penalty kill, and I'd be surprised if they weren't for any other team. You're allowed to do it, and the penalty killing team absolutely takes advantage of that. And the Devils did it more often last season than they did 2 seasons ago. So the Devils had some more unforced outs 2 seasons ago. They had some more clearances, which went to the neutral zone, a few more force outs, a few more pass outs, but those were all replaced by icings. And that was a big deal because in terms of total time killed, and for this chart and the next one, I removed ends. So I removed exits that only took 4 seconds off the clock because the penalty was about to end or the period was going to end. So this way I'm comparing apples to apples. I'm comparing exits that ended with entries. So this way I get an idea of, okay, if the other team had a legitimate shot to get back in the Devils' end of the rink, how much time did they kill? And in terms of total time, icings dwarf everybody else. And the Devils made a huge improvement in icings. They had, what was it? About close to 30 more icings between 2 seasons ago and last season. And in this case, they killed almost 20 more minutes from it. That's huge. And the Devils also managed to kill more time from their clearances and their force outs, despite the fact that they had fewer clearances and fewer forced outs than 2 seasons ago. Carryouts and unforced outs had slight advantages, but that all pales in comparison to the big difference in icings. And if we look at the average time killed, you really see the improvements here. It's no surprise that carryouts and passouts have the highest average. While passouts were very rare and carryouts didn't happen frequently, those are exits where the Devils would have possession. And when you have possession, you have more options. You can forecheck more easily, you can attack more easily, and so on and so forth. But with an icing, you're literally just throwing pucks beyond the neutral zone to the other end of the rink. I will say that the account for the average here is due to a number of factors. It's not as if the Devils suddenly got better at icing the puck. I mean, they did it more frequently, but they didn't suddenly, drag out the length of their icings. It really speaks to the fact that opposing teams took more time to go get back in the Devils' end, and whether or not it's because they want to run their play and they want to run their play so badly that it took them an extra second or two more often than not than they did 2 seasons ago. The Devils were able to forecheck a little bit more, establish more of a presence in the neutral zone. By getting more delays and disruptions of that breakout, you're able to extend your time killed. And if you're able to do that enough, or at least force the opposition to take that extra second, it starts adding up, and you can see it here. So your average, remember, we're talking over 400 icings in this case, so going from 14.5 seconds to just over 15 seconds on average, when you remove all of end of periods, end of penalty, and the outliers that they contain, you see the improvement here. And you can see the improvement in other exits as well, with clearances and force outs and unforced outs. So that really speaks to the fact that the Devils did a better job at establishing enough pressure, or at least having the other team take longer to get back in the zone, and that made things easier for the penalty kill. So those are some pretty big findings, and we can legitimately say that the Devils were more efficient at zone exits than they were last season than they were 2 seasons ago, even though 2 seasons ago they were more varied in the types of exits. So let's look at some correlations. Let's look to see, is there evidence of a relationship between attempts or shots against and time killed? So I've got my data, my tracking results per game, percent time killed, total time killed, and total time defended, which is the inverse of time killed, or total penalty killing time minus total time killed equals total time defended. Natural stat trick has shorthanded Corsi against, Fenwick against, and shots against by game for every team. So I put the two on some scatter plots, and I ran some linear and polynomial line fits in Excel, and these are the R-squared values that came out. So very weak relationships for percent time killed, a better relationship with just time killed, but the inverse of time killed, time defended, the correlation, especially for Corsi against, is quite strong. Not enough to say, that there's definitely a strong correlation. That's typically 0.9 or better. But 0.7, for what I've seen from other analytics studies, isn't too shabby. And it really points to that there may be a connection somewhere. There's probably another confounding factor or two. And it is a weaker correlation for Fenwick and shots against, and I think that really points to the fact that block shots are a big deal on the penalty kill, because the penalty killing team, they're going to be in formations that fill into shooting lanes, get in the way, and they're instructed to get in the way of shots if they can't just prevent the shot from happening or dissuade the other team from making a move. So I would argue that those blocks do happen, and they happen a little bit more often, and therefore you're likely to have a stronger relationship between that with time defended, because that's the time you're spending in your own end of the rink. So I did this for last season's data. The strength of the time defended correlations drove me to do it for both seasons. And while the correlation values are a little weaker, they're still in that range of being something worth looking at. So the big grain of salt here is that this is just 2 seasons of data of one team that I tracked. So but I would argue that this is an encouraging sign to look at other teams and see if this relationship really holds. So if somebody was crazy enough to look at every penalty killing situation from last season for all 30 teams and they found similar correlation values, I'd start to say there's a relationship here. And it's another reason why looking at time matters. So let's look at some player findings. And again, this is going to be very Devil specific. So, getting into that, let's talk about defensemen versus forwards. So we've got forwards and defensemen. Surprising to me, forwards made more zone exits than defensemen. So even though more forwards were involved, the number of Devils at position is really just at least one zone exit. So you have a few players that were just out there in spot duty and made 1 exit, 2 exits, and they made the list. However, in general, I wasn't surprised to see that forwards have a larger distribution or a wider distribution of the types of exits, because they're playing higher up in the zone, and therefore they're more able to make those types of exits. And I'm not surprised that they were better in denials, because the defenseman is going to be deeper in the zone, they're going to be launching the puck more often than not, and therefore the other team is more able to get in the way of that, as opposed to a forward who will be closer to the blue line and therefore be more mindful to make a successful zone exit. But the success rate between 2 seasons ago and last season, you see an improvement in both areas, and that's huge. And you see fewer denials, especially from forwards, going from 2 seasons ago to last season. But in terms of total zone exits, both the defensemen made an improvement, even though the forwards went down a little bit. So you saw some general improvement from the team. Now we're going to get into what drove that. And again, with fewer defensemen in the rotation last season, the average per defenseman, really shot up, and the average success rate shot up. But in general, you can see it here. Your average for forwards was still around 91%. Your average for defensemen, by getting rid of some lesser players, the tide rose, so to speak. So let's look at that. For the next few graphs, I would say the next 6 graphs, the lines are ice time. So higher lines means more ice time. And the bars for this one are zone exits. Green and Larson. Andy Green and Adam Larson led the Devils penalty kill in making exits. They made the most exits in the last 2 seasons, even though Larson he could have only played the first 75% of the games, I would argue. Actually, no, that's not bad. That's bad math. It's actually closer to 80. But of course, he also missed additional time due to the mumps. But even so, he still made more zone exits than anybody not named Andy Green 2 seasons ago. And a full season from him showed him he made over 100 exits, which is rather good. The problem you can see here is that Merrill, Harold, Frazier, and Severson didn't really warrant a lot of ice time and didn't make as many zone exits in their duties. And it's especially sad in Salvador's case because he got 65 minutes in those 15 games. He played prime minutes next to Andy Green, and yet he only had 10 exits and 10 denials. Adam Larson's played 10 games before he got the mumps with Andy Green. He had 16 exits, 4 denials, and did so while playing 20 fewer minutes in 5 fewer games. So Adam Larson was clearly better than Bryce Salvador at this, and it really highlights the fact that you really need capable defensemen. You need 2 of them. You can't just rely on just one guy carrying the load like Andy Green. And going back to this past season, Moore and Schlemko, while they didn't exactly light the world on fire with the number of exits that they made, they effectively supplanted the work of Harold, Frazier, Salvador, and Merrill, which allowed and Merrill really didn't step up in his lesser ice time. So that's how the Devils were able to consolidate the number of defensemen that they used. If we look at exit per minute, which is now the bar chart, Green and Larson made big improvements in this past season. Granted, they also played a little less ice time, which also helped. But the fact of the matter is they still played more than anybody else among the Devils defensemen, and they were just better at, they were more efficient at generating exits. Severson was excellent in his spot duty, but again, he had spot duty. And John Merrill, 2 seasons ago looked like, hey, he could be a guy that could be a penalty killer. Last season showed that maybe maybe that's a little too hasty here. The big problem here is that we know that with John Moore had a decent rate, but David Schlemko's decent rate, if we assume it's decent, he's gone. He's on another team now. So who replaces Schlemko? Merrill? Severson? Lovejoy? Oh, and of course that Adam Larson guy is gone too. So you see some pretty big holes when you start thinking ahead to next season because Green and Larson did well, and if Moore and Schlemko were just acceptable, then half of that crew is now gone, and that's a big loss. And you don't readily see somebody to really take over, especially with this particular graph. And if we look at success rate, if you want to know how the Devils defenseman had a better success rate, well, getting rid of Salvador, and his 50% success rate would help. Getting rid of Frazier's just over 60% success rate helped. Helgeson's usage was even more limited, so you took away, and plus when he made his zone exit, he succeeded all the time, so that helped. And Moore and Schlemko were actually not terrible with respect to their success rates. But the big improvement is with Andy Green. So even though Larson went down, Andy Green was much better, and because he still played more minutes than everybody else and attempted more zone exits than anybody else, his improvement, again, was a rising tide for the Devils defensemen. So that really highlights how important Green was, and that he really did improve from 2 seasons ago to last season. Now let's look at some forwards. We're going back to raw zone exits again. And, 2 seasons ago, it's amazing to think that Elias and Camilleri were significant players on the PK. It wasn't just Henrique, Zajac, and Giunta. But you can see a very even distribution of, 6 forwards that were used fairly frequently. Actually 7, now that I'm counting it correctly. But last season, the coaches said we're going to lean heavily on Henrique and Zajac, and we're going to lean on Giunta and Stempniak as the second unit, and Josefson and Palmieri will chip in as needed. And by and large, it was successful in that Zajac and Henrique made many more zone exits than they did 2 seasons ago. Giunta made an improvement as well. Stempniak was better than Josefson was 2 seasons ago in terms of raw zone exits generated. And, Josefson went down. Palmieri didn't contribute much. But, Elias and Camilleri were out of the picture. So it was really the top 3 guys here, Henrique, Zajac, and Giunta, that really filled in the gap, both in terms from a minutes and an exit standpoint. In terms of zone exits per minute rate, you really get to see how much improved Henrique was. Zajac surprisingly went down. It wasn't too bad, but it was still a surprising decrease from a guy who increased his raw number of zone exits. I guess the additional minutes just didn't work out in his favor. But Henrique really improved, and it's amazing and surprising to me, Giunta improved. In fact, he was just below Henrique last season. And of course, excluding Elias in his token few minutes, Giunta was very good. And the last 2 graphs on the next one is going to really show that Steven Giunta was a penalty killing asset. I know Steven Giunta was very good at something. It is surprising and amazing. Josefson went down a little bit in exit rate. Stempniak was actually pretty good, supplanting Zubris, the few contributions of Rutu and Sestito, and the few contributions. But when Elias and Camilleri were playing 2 seasons ago, again, it was remarkable how effective they were. And it is a shock but not that much of a shock considering their injury situation and how they were regarded, by the coaches, that they just didn't get much of a chance last season. So let's look at success rate. And Giunta was the leader 2 seasons ago, and he was the leader among all the forwards that played a significant number of ice time on the penalty kill last season. Again, Elias and Camilleri were perfect in their spot duty, but the fact of the matter is that Giunta was great 2 seasons ago, and he was even better last season. Again, when he's sort of perfect for that triangle plus one. One of the main criticisms of Giunta is that he gets to be too focused on the puck. He just focuses too much and just goes after it. But that's exactly what you want for the guy who's the plus one on the penalty kill. And knowing that Giunta, he's been around the league long enough to know that he just needs to get it done quickly. He just needs to react. It's better to make a B play, instead of just trying to force an A play, for lack of a better phrase. And, that worked on the penalty kill. And it also was a big help last season that Henrique and Zajac were more successful at attempting their zone exits. They just improved to where there were 2 years ago. And that led to more zone exits in addition to getting more ice time. So the big three here really stepped up. Josefsson even provided an improvement. Palmieri, who didn't generate very many zone exits and didn't have a great zone exit per minute rate, I wouldn't necessarily suggest he should be on the PK next season, but at least he was successful. I mean, Stempniak's really the only one among quote-unquote regular penalty killers that really wasn't all that impressive. And even then, his level was close to where Zajac was 2 seasons ago. So, the forwards really, a lot of good signs here, which was excellent. So let's look at some general conclusions and observations from all this. So the Devils were more efficient in their exits, and that contributed to having a more successful penalty kill. It also helped that, the goaltending was good and all that, but they've also had fewer denials. Their success rates were better, and they had improved efforts at extending exits, as evidenced by the fact that their average time killed per exit type was better across the board, except for carryouts and passouts. And again, the fact that it was better for icings is the big gain, because icings happen more often than anything else. Icings did not kill the most time on average, but they were performed the most. Defensemen did attempt more icings, more so than forwards. That's where a lot of the denials came from. You could argue that the denials could have been clearances, but, six or half dozen of the other. The fact of the matter is that, by and large, if a defenseman on the New Jersey Devils was going to go make an exit and they were successful, more often than not, it was going to be an icing. Whereas with a forward, it wasn't necessarily a foregone conclusion. I will say again that the player was often very quick at attempting an icing. They didn't dilly-dally on it. They just went ahead and did it. Going forward with the Devils PK, this project shows that turnover is going to be a really big deal for next season. Adam Larsson is gone, and he carried a big load of that penalty kill as a defenseman. There's going to be a lot of faith put into Ben Lovejoy, and it's really unclear who on defense really deserves more minutes. Because, again, you can't just plug in Moore and Schlemko because, oh yeah, Schlemko's gone too. At forward, Zajac and Adam Henrique led the forwards, and you have a lot more confidence that they're going to do a good job next season. But Giunta was very effective in his duties, even if he was only relegated to the second unit. And he's unsigned. So he could sign with anybody, and perhaps he does. In theory, the Devils could still re-sign him. But it looks like that the Devils are probably not going to do that. And Lee Stempniak is now with the Carolina Hurricanes. So even though Stempniak wasn't necessarily the greatest thing on 2 skates on the PK, the Devils need to identify some forwards on the second unit. It can't just be, okay, Josefsson, you and somebody else fills it in. There's got to be some good thinking behind this. So is Josefsson going to get better with more minutes? Are we going to see somebody else on the PK? We'll see. Some general conclusions on the PK. So I've got 6 here. First, you want to win that opening faceoff because it helps, in terms of generating a zone exit right from the get-go, and it guards against that zero exit calamity, which is, again, the worst situation that I've seen in doing 2 seasons of this. Second point, power plays will run their breakouts, especially after a nice puck. So if the Devils are able to force the other team into their end of the rink, typically, they're just going to revert, move behind the net or take that extra time to change players and move players in position to run the breakout however they want, which goes back to my earlier point of if the Devils are able to disrupt that or delay it, either by how whether they're forechecking, whether they're standing them up in the neutral zone, the other team makes a mistake, they're forced to make a mistake, their timing is off, whatever. That just all extends the zone time beyond the 12 to 16 seconds an exit may provide. Your average icing yielded between the 2 seasons was somewhere between 14.5 and 15.1 seconds. If you want to go beyond that, you got to get some extra help outside of the zone. And that will yield gains because, again, the time you're doing that, and if it's successful, you're not defending. And when you're not defending, hey, fewer attempts against, fewer shots against, and fewer Fenwick against. Quick re-entries are rare after icings, by the way, because they really do want to run their plays. If opposition power plays really want to get around this, maybe they got to consider mixing it up a little bit more honest just to keep the Devils honest. 3, there's a lot of variation within the time killed within games. So I've seen and I've done games where the Devils would, they would kill, like a minute out of 2 in the first period. And then later that period, they can only kill like 20 seconds out of 2 minutes. There's just a lot of variation between whether or not the other team can make that pass, run that play correctly, and, get that puck luck in their favor to make a play successful. For the very next unit, very next time, same players, same units, same matchup, same period, same ice. And, the other team just doesn't know what they're doing. So there's a lot of variation involved. So you want to look at this at a higher level with a lot of games involved. You don't want to just make these conclusions off of just one game or 2 game. It's something that you want to monitor over the course of a season. 4th, assuming penalty kills kill somewhere between 39 to 44% of time in a season, which is, taking out the half percentages, that's what the Devils did between the last 2 seasons, it really highlights the fact that your goaltender does have to be your best penalty killer, because you're going to deal with more attack time than not. And again, time defended seems to correlate with Corsi again. So that means the goaltender is going to have to pay attention. They're going to have to track the puck, and they're going to have to be ready to stop, make saves or be wary of attempts so they're in the right position for it. So therefore your goaltender really, does have to be good on a PK, because guess what? No matter how good your skaters are over the course of a season, they're going to be in their own end of the rink defending more often than not, which makes sense because they're down a man. To that extent, an effective PK really needs all 8 players to be able to make contributions. So if you have 4 skaters able to make zone exits and be able to make great reads, whether or not they're the fastest players, the smartest players, or so forth, if they're able to do the job, you're going to go a lot further than having somebody who's great in their own end paired with somebody who isn't great. Somebody who's quick enough and somebody who's very slow to make a read and make a good reaction. Somebody who's, knows that just to get the puck out, at all costs, as opposed to somebody who tries too hard to do something great and ends up failing and, costing the team. You want to have all 4 of your skaters, or all 3 of your skaters in some cases, be able to make exits to be having an effective penalty kill. And lastly, and I'm repeating this point again, icings really are incentivized. It's a safer play, it's a more plausible play, it's a more feasible play if you're a penalty killing team. So even though carryouts and passouts kill more time on average, it allows you to have more possession, allows you to have more opportunities, that opportunity isn't always there to do that. So the Devils just threw the puck away, and oftentimes that was the right play to do because they can do that. And they were better at doing it last season than they were 2 seasons ago. Let's go over some potential improvements. I will admit that this methodology is not perfect. As mentioned, more detailed zone exit types could yield more information. Ryan suggested to me zone exit assists, and I didn't realize until halfway of this past summer that would be a really good idea to identify more information on what creates the zone exit, because that gets more into what really happens on, in your own end of the rink with respect to, what is the defense doing, or maybe these exits are really happening because the Devils are making good heads-up plays, so they're making plays off the run of play. Noting actions that extend kill time beyond the zone exit really can help explain, is anybody particularly successful at extending time killed? Who's good at forechecking? Who's typically attacking? What's going on? That would be helpful. Or maybe the Devils are just getting lucky and the other teams are just making mistakes on their own end. Better video is always going to yield better results. I use what's available at NHL.tv. Those are the TV broadcasts. If you have access to game tape with more angles and you're able to control it better and view it better, that's better. And lastly, more teams to analyze, really will help that correlation. It will help for a more general understanding of what's considered good for a forward or good for a defenseman in terms of success rate, or what's a good exit per minute rate, or what other teams are generally doing. Maybe we'll see something different from another team. Again, this is just 2 seasons of one team. And lastly, there's just a lot more that can be looked at and concluded from this data. So this is an uncut presentation. It's up at All About the Jersey. By the time you see this, I'm about to be presenting, or I just presented at RITHAC. So if you have any additional questions or requests or thoughts or opinions, let me know in the comments. Shoot me an email. Talk to me. Let me know. And most of all, I thank you all for listening. Go Devils.